On November 14th, 1976, at 10:23 post-meridian, Christopher John Boyce arrived at Terminal 2 of Mexico City International Airport. The air hung thick with diesel exhaust and cigarette smoke. Christopher John Boyce walked through the departure gate. He wore a brown leather jacket despite the humid 78-degree evening. His sandy hair was slightly too long, falling past his collar. This was a common style for young Americans in the mid-70s. In his right front pocket, pressed against his thigh, sat a small brass key. This was the kind that opened post office boxes. He had touched it unconsciously 17 times since leaving his hotel. His flight to Mazatlan boarded in 40 minutes. Two men in short-sleeved Guayabera shirts stood near the Aeromexico counter. They did not look at each other, nor at anything in particular. However, they were watching. One man held a folded copy of the Excelsior newspaper. The other smoked a Del Icado cigarette down to the filter. He then immediately lit another. Boyce did not see them. He was thinking about the ocean. He imagined lying on the beach at Mazatlan. He also thought about the $76,000 that was supposed to be waiting for him. This was payment for the last batch of intelligence. His handler had promised it. The Russians always paid. This was unlike his previous job at TRW Systems Group. There he made $140 a week routing classified cables. These cables concerned satellite systems. Their very existence could tilt the balance of global power. He was not supposed to read these cables. However, he could not help reading them. They sat right on his desk in the black vault. They required nothing more than eyes and a functioning brain to understand them. He understood that what the United States was doing in geosynchronous orbit above the Soviet Union was problematic. If not illegal under international law, it was the kind of thing that would start wars. This would happen if Moscow ever found out the full extent of it. The public address system crackled in Spanish. It announced something about Guadalajara. Boyce shifted his overnight bag to his left shoulder. Inside, wrapped in a t-shirt and then in a plastic shopping bag from Sanborn's, sat a small metal canister. The microfilm contained technical specifications for the Central Intelligence Agency's Rhyolite satellite system. These specifications included orbital parameters, sensor capabilities, and signal processing algorithms. Most critically, it detailed the exact frequencies and encryption methods. These were used to communicate with payloads positioned 22,300 miles above Soviet missile fields. This information did not merely compromise national security, it also rendered an entire surveillance architecture obsolete overnight. The brass key pressed against his thigh. One of the men near the counter dropped his newspaper. He bent to pick it up. He then made eye contact with someone behind Boyce. It was a small gesture. It was practiced. It was the kind of thing one would miss if not looking for it. Christopher Boyce was not looking for it. The official story finally broke in January 1977. It sounded almost mundane in its suburban banality. Two young men from Palos Verdes, California, had sold satellite secrets to the Soviet Union. One was a defense contractor employee. The other was a drug dealer. They sold the secrets for less than the cost of a modest house. The Los Angeles Times ran a headline about two people from the Southland held as spies. This headline appeared above the fold. The article mentioned TRW. It also mentioned classified information. It noted arrests in Mexico and California. What it did not mention, however, was that these two college dropouts had compromised the United States' most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. This operation had become central to détente, arms control verification, and the entire strategic calculus of the Cold War. This happened at a precise moment. The setup was almost absurdly simple. TRW Systems Group in Redondo Beach, California, held contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency. Their role was to build and operate satellites. These were not spy satellites in the traditional sense. They were not the photographic reconnaissance birds that Jimmy Carter would accidentally reveal in a speech the following year. Instead, they were something more subtle and in some ways more valuable. These were signals intelligence platforms. They could hover in geosynchronous orbit above Soviet territory. They listened to microwave communications, telemetry from missile tests, and radio traffic from military installations. This was the Rhyolite program. It was codenamed Frosting and Aquacade in various iterations. These were eyes and ears in the sky. The Soviets knew these existed. However, they could not shoot them down. They could not jam them effectively. Most importantly, the Soviets did not fully understand them. Christopher Boyce started working in the TRW Black Vault in July 1974. This was the secured communications room. Classified message traffic flowed between Langley, Virginia, and various operational sites. Boyce began this work 3 months after his 21st birthday. His father, an ex-FBI agent turned McDonnell Douglas security director, helped him get the job. The background check was cursory. Boyce had no criminal record. He had attended a good Catholic high school. He briefly studied seminary before dropping out. He seemed clean-cut despite his hair. He passed a polygraph. He received a top-secret clearance with special compartmented information access. This kind of access required special badges, special vaults, and special everything. His job was essentially clerical. He received encrypted cables via secure teletype. He decrypted them using a KW7 cryptographic device. Then he routed them to appropriate TRW personnel. He also maintained logs. He was not supposed to analyze the content. He was not supposed to ask questions. He was supposed to be like furniture. He was human furniture with a security clearance. His role was facilitating the flow of information between people who actually mattered. However, Boyce read everything. The cables contained operational details about Rhyolite missions. They contained Central Intelligence Agency assessments of Soviet capabilities. Most damningly, they contained evidence that the Central Intelligence Agency was conducting surveillance operations against Australia. Australia was an ally whose territory housed key ground stations for the Rhyolite system. The cables discussed manipulating Australian politics. They discussed keeping certain information from Canberra. They also discussed treating a sovereign allied nation as a convenient real estate holding for United States intelligence infrastructure. Boyce had read Daulton Lee. He had studied Cold War history. He considered himself politically sophisticated. He found this offensive. Later, in interrogations, he would claim that discovering the Central Intelligence Agency was spying on Australia represented a moral turning point. He stated that selling secrets to the Soviets was a form of ideological protest against United States imperial overreach. This rationalization would play well in certain academic circles. However, it was also convenient nonsense. The truth, as federal prosecutors would establish, was simpler. Christopher Boyce wanted money. He wanted excitement. He wanted to feel important. He wanted to be a player in the great game, not a clerk. Furthermore, his childhood friend Andrew Daulton Lee also wanted money. Lee was a small-time drug dealer with a cocaine habit and a flair for melodrama. They made contact with the Soviet embassy in Mexico City in April 1975. Lee walked in with photocopied documents. The KGB resident expected either a provocation or a lunatic. Instead, he found himself looking at legitimate classified material. This material concerned United States satellite operations. Within 3 weeks, they established a protocol. Boyce would photograph documents using a Minox camera. Lee would carry the microfilm to Mexico City. The KGB would then pay cash. Tradecraft was minimal. Security was practically non-existent. The operation succeeded primarily for 2 reasons. Nobody at TRW imagined that a 22-year-old cable clerk would have the audacity to betray his country. Additionally, nobody at the Central Intelligence Agency imagined that someone with Boyce's access would be stupid enough to involve a drug-dealing friend as his courier. The geopolitical stakes were enormous. By 1976, Rhyolite represented the United States' primary method for monitoring Soviet compliance with strategic arms. Limitation Treaty 1. This treaty was signed in 1972. The satellites could intercept telemetry from Soviet missile tests. This provided data about throw weight, accuracy, and multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle deployment. This was not academic information. It was the empirical foundation for arms control verification. If the Soviets understood exactly what Rhyolite could and could not detect, they could design tests to evade surveillance. This would render United States intelligence assessments were worthless. They could also cheat on treaty obligations with impunity. In Moscow, the GRU and KGB were engaged in their own bureaucratic warfare. They fought over who would control the Boyce-Lee Intelligence Hall. In Washington, the Central Intelligence Agency remained blissfully unaware. One of their most sensitive programs had been compromised. In Redondo Beach, Christopher Boyce arrived at work each morning. He processed classified cables. He occasionally photographed particularly interesting documents. He then went home to his parents' house in Palos Verdes. He kept his Minox camera hidden in his bedroom closet. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out book. The brass key in his pocket opened Post Office Box 711 in Riverside, California. Lee used it to receive communications from Mexico City. Boyce touched the key constantly. It was a physical talisman connecting him to his secret life. In meetings with Soviet handlers, Lee would produce it as proof of identity. The Russians, however, found this particular piece of tradecraft unnecessarily theatrical. Still, they paid. Between April 1975 and November 1976, Boyce and Lee received approximately $76,000. This was roughly $400,000 in 2025 value. It was still a fraction of the material's actual value to Soviet intelligence. By late 1976, they had passed information concerning several key areas. This included rhyolite orbital mechanics and sensor footprints. They also shared details about Pyramida, a project involving Chinese communications intercepts. Furthermore, they provided information on Argus, a program targeting Soviet missile telemetry. Central Intelligence Agency cryptographic systems and key management procedures were also revealed. They identified locations and capabilities of ground stations in Australia. Finally, they disclosed the identities of intelligence personnel at TRW and in the field. Every document photographed represented a cascading intelligence failure. Every roll of microfilm delivered was also a failure. Every transaction represented one as well. This was not a sophisticated penetration by a trained hostile service. It was not a blackmail operation against a compromised target. It was simply a bored 22-year-old with a clearance and a Minox camera. His drug-dealing friend liked playing spy. What was really happening behind the sealed doors at Langley and inside the fortified walls of the Soviet embassy in Mexico City was a masterclass in compartmented ignorance. This was a situation where every actor possessed partial information. The complete picture existed nowhere. It was only in scattered fragments across continents. In Moscow, at the GRU's 4th Directorate headquarters on Khorshchevskoye Shoshe, analysts received microfilm batches. These arrived through circuitous routing. The material did not arrive with neat labels explaining provenance. It came tagged with handling codes, source identifiers, and bureaucratic markings. These markings obscured as much as they revealed. The GRU's satellite specialists saw technical specifications for United States signals intelligence platforms. They recognized immediately that the information was genuine. Orbital parameters matched observed satellite behavior. Frequency data aligned with signals their own monitoring stations had detected. However, they could not decrypt these signals, yet they did not know how the material was being acquired. The compartmented nature of Soviet intelligence meant that the technical analysts never met the case officers handling Lee in Mexico City. They never understood that the source was a walk-in amateur with no formal training. The Committee for State Security, meanwhile, was furious. The Mexico City Residentura, pronounced Res-Identura, technically subordinate to Committee for State Security Control, had allowed the main intelligence directorate to dominate the operation. Every time Andrew Daulton Lee showed up at the Soviet compound on Calzada de Tacubaya, pronounced Calzada de Tacubaya, he dealt primarily with handlers affiliated with military intelligence. He was usually disheveled. He was often visibly intoxicated. Sometimes he carried microfilm in his jacket pocket, as if it were a pack of cigarettes. The Committee for State Security considered Rhyolite information within their counterintelligence mandate. The main intelligence directorate considered signals intelligence their domain. This interagency warfare meant that no one exercised proper control over Lee. No one insisted on improved tradecraft. No one seemed particularly concerned that a courier who snorted cocaine and boasted about working with the Russians might represent a catastrophic operational security risk. Declassified Central Intelligence Agency documents from 1977 reveal something specific. A damage assessment was filed under project codename Wallkill. These documents show that Soviet technical teams immediately began adapting their communication security based on Boyce's material. By August 1975, just 4 months after the initial contact, National Security Agency analysts detected changes in Soviet missile test telemetry encryption. The changes were subtle. They included modified frequency hopping patterns and altered burst transmission protocols. However, these changes corresponded precisely to information Boyce had photographed. The National Security Agency noticed this. They flagged it. They wrote a report noting that Soviet communications security improvements suggested a possible compromise of United States collection capabilities. The report circulated through proper channels. It generated some concerned memos. Ultimately, it went nowhere because no one wanted to believe that Rhyolite, the crown jewel of satellite signals intelligence, could be compromised. At the Raymond Woolworth Company's Black Vault, Boyce had access to the Central Intelligence Agency's pilot operational traffic. This was the encrypted teletype system linking Langley with field stations and contractors. The KW7 encryption device on his desk was theoretically secure. However, physical security around the decrypted plaintext was minimal. Boyce's job required him to examine cable traffic to determine routing. He sat alone in a windowless room for 8-hour shifts. He was surrounded by filing cabinets containing materials. These materials were classified as top secret, special intelligence, and talent keyhole. No supervisor was present. There were no surveillance cameras. No audit logs tracked which documents he accessed. The security model assumed that anyone trusted enough to have the job was trustworthy enough not to abuse it. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. The technical details Boyce compromised were extraordinarily specific. Rhyolite satellites, positioned in geosynchronous orbit at 22,300 miles altitude, used 90-foot diameter mesh antennas to collect microwave signals. The satellites could not photograph targets. Instead, they listened. Soviet landlines were largely invulnerable. However, Soviet microwave relay towers broadcasted communications from Moscow to Siberia. They also broadcasted from military headquarters to remote installations. These towers operated on frequencies that Rhyolite could intercept with remarkable fidelity. The satellite's signal processing systems were designed by the Raymond Woolworth Company engineers. These systems were refined through operational testing. They could discriminate between background noise and meaningful communications. They could identify individual transmitter signatures. According to cables Boyce photographed, they could even reconstruct conversations from partial intercepts using advanced algorithmic processing. The Committee for State Security's Technical Directorate studied Boyce's microfilm. They used high-powered microscopes in a laboratory at Yasenevo, pronounced Yasenevo. They understood the implications. If American satellites could intercept microwave relay communications, then Soviet military commands transmitted via domestic telecommunications infrastructure were potentially compromised. The solution was not to abandon microwave technology because the Soviet Union's vast geography made it irreplaceable. The solution was to encrypt more aggressively. It was also to assume that anything transmitted was being heard. They needed to change codes more frequently and introduce deceptive traffic. By September 1976, Central Intelligence Agency analysts at the Office of Signals Intelligence Operations noticed something troubling. Soviet communications that had been reliably interceptable for years were becoming progressively harder to decrypt. It was not impossible, as American cryptanalysts were extraordinarily skilled. However, decryption was slower and less complete. The Soviets were not just changing codes, they were changing their entire operational security posture. This suggested deep knowledge of American collection capabilities. The Central Intelligence Agency launched an internal security review. Polygraph examiners questioned personnel with access to Rhyolite materials. Security officers examined physical security at contractor facilities. They looked for evidence of sophisticated penetration, such as Committee for State Security moles, technical surveillance, or compromised communication channels. They did not seriously consider that a 22-year-old clerk might be photographing documents. They did not consider him giving them to a drug dealer to carry to Mexico City. This scenario seemed too absurd, too amateurish, and too stupid to be real. Christopher Boyce, meanwhile, was growing bored with espionage. The initial thrill had faded into routine. This included the secret meetings Lee described. It also included the rolls of cash delivered in envelopes. The sense of being important also became routine. Boyce photographed documents. He passed film to Lee. Lee went to Mexico. Then Lee came back with money. They split it. This pattern repeated. By late 1976, Boyce was considering quitting the Raymond Woolworth Company. He thought about traveling. Perhaps he would do something that felt less like a clerical job. The brass key in his pocket had become just another object. The weight was so familiar, he barely noticed it anymore. Lee, conversely, was spiraling. His cocaine use had escalated from recreational to compulsive. He owed money to dealers. He owed money to people who broke legs when debts went unpaid. The Soviet payments should have been substantial. However, they kept disappearing into his habit and his debts. He began pressuring his handlers for larger sums. He also asked for advance payments and special considerations. The Committee for State Security officer managing him found Lee increasingly erratic. This officer was identified in Federal Bureau of Investigation documents as Victor. He was a 34-year-old major operating under diplomatic cover. In one meeting, Lee showed up 6 hours late. In another, he forgot to bring the microfilm entirely. In a third, he demanded $50,000 for what he claimed was the most important material yet. However, he could not articulate why it was important because he did not understand the technical content. The Wall-Kill damage assessment was compiled after Boyce's arrest. It includes a section analyzing Soviet handling of the operation. Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence officers studied the pattern of payments and meetings. They concluded that Soviet intelligence had essentially stumbled into an intelligence windfall. Then they mismanaged it through bureaucratic incompetence. The main intelligence directorate and the Committee for State Security fought over control. Neither service imposed proper operational security. Lee met with handlers in public locations, such as cafes, parks, and street corners. He carried microfilm in his pocket. He told multiple people in California that he was doing business in Mexico. This created a pattern of cross-border travel that should have triggered scrutiny. The only reason the operation lasted 19 months was that no one in American intelligence imagined that such an amateurish operation could be real. The technical chess game between Langley and Moscow played out in satellite orbits and encrypted cables. Each side made moves without fully understanding what the other knew. The Central Intelligence Agency launched new Rhyolite satellites without realizing the Soviets understood their capabilities. The Soviets modified their communications security without fully exploiting their knowledge of American vulnerabilities. Both sides operated partially blind. They made decisions based on incomplete information. They tried to optimize strategies in a game where the rules kept changing. Inside Boyce's Black Vault, the cables kept coming. These included messages about Chinese nuclear tests, intercepted through Pyramida satellites. Updates on Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile development were derived from telemetry analysis. There was operational planning for satellite repositioning. Damage assessments from solar flares affecting sensor performance also arrived. This was an endless stream of information. It revealed the full scope of America's overhead surveillance apparatus to anyone bothering to examine it comprehensively. Boyce examined it all. He photographed the most interesting parts. He passed the film to Lee with the casual disregard of someone who had never experienced real consequences for anything. The brass key opened Box 711 in Riverside. There, Lee sometimes found messages from Mexico City. These were written on innocuous-looking letters using basic codes. These codes would not have fooled a moderately talented high school student. The tradecraft was embarrassingly primitive. Nevertheless, it worked for 19 months. This was because the security establishment could not believe it was real. The turning point came on a warm evening in January 1977. However, the cascade of failures that led to that moment stretched back across months of mounting recklessness. On January 5, Andrew Daulton Lee approached the Soviet embassy compound in Mexico City at approximately 7:15 post-meridian. He had been drinking. His flight from Los Angeles had been delayed. He had missed his scheduled meeting time. He was carrying microfilm in his jacket pocket. This contained 4 small canisters. Boyce had described them as satellite communications protocols. However, Lee did not really understand them beyond their tradable value. The Soviet compound on Calzada de Tacubaya occupied a full city block. It was surrounded by walls. Mexican federal police monitored it under an informal arrangement with American intelligence. The arrangement was simple. Mexico allowed the Soviets to maintain their embassy. However, it monitored who came and went. The Central Intelligence Agency received reports on American citizens making contact. The system worked reasonably well for catching amateur spies, defectors, and intelligence tourists. It worked less well when the subject exercised even minimal caution. Lee exercised no caution. He walked directly to the front gate and rang the bell. No one answered. The embassy was hosting a function. This was some diplomatic reception that had most personnel occupied. Lee rang again. He waited. He rang a third time. Then he made a decision. This decision would later be analyzed in Federal Bureau of Investigation training materials as an example of catastrophic operational judgment. He threw something over the wall. What he threw was a message packet. This was a sealed envelope containing a note. It identified himself using his Committee for State Security assigned codename Luis, pronounced Lou-E-S. It also requested emergency contact. The packet sailed over the concrete wall. It cleared the landscaping. It landed approximately 12 feet from where two Mexican police officers sat. They were in an unmarked Dodge sedan, conducting routine surveillance. The officers saw Lee throw something. They saw him wait by the gate for several minutes. Eventually, they saw him walk away. He headed north on Calzada de Tacubaya. The officers radioed their command post. They asked what they should do about the American who had just thrown something into the Soviet embassy. The answer came back quickly. They were told to detain him for questioning. Two officers on foot patrol intercepted Lee 3 blocks from the embassy. He was sweating despite the cool evening. He kept touching his jacket pocket. When asked to identify himself, he provided a passport. This passport showed multiple entries to Mexico over the past 19 months. This pattern suggested either business or smuggling. The officers asked about his visit to the Soviet embassy. Lee claimed he had been lost. He said he was looking for the American consulate. He claimed he had stopped to ask directions. This explanation might have worked. However, the Mexican officers had watched him ring the bell repeatedly and throw something over the wall. These behaviors were inconsistent with asking directions. They arrested him on suspicion of trespassing. They took him to a local precinct station. There, in a holding cell, Lee made his second catastrophic error. He tried to swallow the microfilm. The attempt was partially successful. He managed to destroy 2 of the 4 canisters before officers restrained him. The remaining canisters, extracted from his mouth, contained photographs of documents marked Top Secret, Special Intelligence, Talent Keyhole. The Mexican officers dealt primarily with drunk tourists and petty criminals. They suddenly realized they had something vastly beyond their jurisdiction. They contacted the Mexico City Central Intelligence Agency station. At Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, the duty officer received a flash cable. It arrived at 11:47 post-meridian Washington time. The cable reported that an American national had been detained in Mexico City. This person was in possession of classified United States government material. Contact with the Soviet embassy was suspected. The cable urgently requested instructions. It included Lee's passport information and a description of the recovered microfilm. Within 3 hours, the Federal Bureau of Investigation identified Christopher John Boyce as Lee's known associate. Boyce held a top-secret clearance. He worked at TRW. Boyce also had access to satellite program information. At 4:20 anti-meridian, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents in Los Angeles received authorization. They were to conduct immediate surveillance of Boyce's residence in Palos Verdes. Christopher Boyce woke up on January the 6th at his usual time. He ate breakfast with his family and drove to work at TRW. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents followed him. They watched him badge into the secure facility. They then contacted TRW security. Agents identified themselves and requested immediate assistance in detaining an employee suspected of espionage. At 10:15 anti-meridian, Boyce sat at his desk in the Black Vault. He was processing routine cable traffic. 2 Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents and a TRW security director entered the vault. They asked him to stand. They identified themselves. They informed him that his friend Andrew Daulton Lee had been arrested in Mexico City with classified material in his possession. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's arrest report, Boyce said nothing. He simply stood. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not deny anything. He looked at the encrypted teletype machine, at the filing cabinets, and at the documents spread across his desk. He seemed to deflate. This physical collapse suggested relief more than fear, as though some part of him had been waiting for this moment. The interrogation lasted 11 hours. Boyce initially refused to speak. He began talking around 3 o'clock post-meridian. This was not because the interrogators used particularly sophisticated techniques. They did not. Instead, he seemed almost eager to explain himself. He wanted to describe what he had done and why. He articulated the political rationale he had constructed. This justified betraying the satellite programs he had spent 2 years helping compromise. He admitted photographing documents. He admitted giving film to Lee. He also admitted knowing the material went to the Soviet Union. Agents asked him to quantify how much material he had passed. Boyce estimated maybe 30 or 40 rolls of film. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's technical team analyzed TRW's document access logs. They cross-referenced these logs against dates when Lee traveled to Mexico City. The team eventually concluded the number was closer to 60 rolls. These rolls contained over 2,000 photographs of classified material. The human decision that changed everything was not the arrest. By January 6, the damage was done. The turning point was Boyce's decision during interrogation. He provided detailed descriptions of exactly what he had compromised. Most espionage subjects, even when caught, minimize their actions. They claim ignorance of consequences. They protect what they can. Boyce did the opposite. He described the satellite programs. He explained the technical capabilities. He identified specific cables containing particularly sensitive information. He did this not because he was cooperating with investigators. He refused to formally cooperate. He wanted them to understand the significance of what he had done. He also wanted to force the intelligence establishment to confront the vulnerability of their systems. The Federal Bureau of Investigation team listened to Boyce describe Rhyolite's capabilities. They realized the damage assessment would be extraordinary. One agent, a 19-year veteran of counterintelligence work, later testified. He stated that Boyce's revelations represented the most significant compromise of satellite intelligence capabilities in the history of the United States intelligence community. The agent was not engaging in hyperbole. The Rhyolite program cost billions of dollars to develop. The satellites could not be easily repositioned or redesigned. The Soviets now knew what America could and could not intercept. This rendered years of intelligence collection potentially compromised. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence officials learned about Lee's arrest through their Mexico City station. The initial reaction was confusion. They wondered why their agent, codenamed Louise, had approached the embassy openly. They also questioned why he had been carrying microfilm on his person. Furthermore, they asked why he had not followed established protocols. The confusion then shifted to alarm. They understood that Lee had been detained with physical evidence. He had led authorities to his American contact. The entire operation had collapsed, not through sophisticated counterintelligence work, but through spectacular operational incompetence. The General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate moved quickly to extract whatever value remained. Analysts compiled comprehensive reports on Rhyolite capabilities. These were based on Boyce's material. These reports circulated to Soviet satellite designers, to military communications planners, and to strategic planners at the Ministry of Defense. The information would influence Soviet space programs for years. It would inform decisions about where to locate sensitive communications facilities. It would also shape the entire architecture of Soviet signals intelligence defense. The State Security Committee, meanwhile, conducted a post-mortem. The report, portions of which were revealed after the Soviet Union's collapse, was scathing. It stated the operation had been managed without adequate tradecraft. It had relied on an unreliable and unstable courier. It had also failed to implement basic security protocols. This ultimately compromised multiple Soviet intelligence officers through association with a captured agent. 3 officers involved in handling Lee were quietly reassigned to less sensitive positions. The Mexico City resident received a formal reprimand. At TRW, security teams began the grim task. They determined exactly what Boyce had accessed. The Black Vault contained approximately 14,000 classified documents. Boyce had worked there for 942 days. Assuming he had photographed just 1% of available material meant 140 compromised documents. The actual number was estimated at between 300 and 400 documents. This was based on Boyce's descriptions and his work schedule. This represented roughly 3% of everything in the vault. Each compromised document required individual damage assessment. Technical teams had to determine what this revealed about United States capabilities. They also needed to know how Soviet intelligence would exploit it. Operational changes were required to mitigate the compromise. This process took 14 months and consumed thousands of analyst hours. Some assessments were straightforward. For example, a technical specification for satellite sensors meant the Soviets could develop countermeasures. Other assessments were impossibly complex. A cable discussing Central Intelligence Agency operations in Australia might compromise specific operations. It might endanger specific personnel. It could damage diplomatic relationships. It might also trigger parliamentary inquiries that could shut down ground stations critical to satellite operations. The brass key sat in an evidence bag at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Los Angeles field office. Agents had recovered it from Boyce during his arrest. They had used it to open Box 711 in Riverside. They found nothing inside except innocuous mail. However, the key itself, examined under forensic microscopy, carried fingerprints from both Boyce and Lee. This was physical proof of their conspiracy, a small brass artifact representing 19 months of sustained betrayal. The turning point was not the arrest. It was the moment Boyce sat in an interrogation room. He began explaining in precise technical detail exactly what American satellites could do. He also explained exactly what he had told the Soviets about those capabilities. That moment marked the transition from a containable security breach to a catastrophic intelligence failure. It went from a manageable crisis to a strategic disaster. This required complete program reassessment. The revelation of what Boyce and Lee had done emerged gradually, in layers. It was like an archaeological excavation of failure. The initial public disclosure came on January 17, 1977. At that time, the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles filed formal charges. These charges were against Christopher John Boyce and Andrew Daulton Lee. The indictment mentioned espionage. It also mentioned classified information, TRW, and Mexico. What it did not mention was Rhyolite or any specific details about what had been compromised. The government desperately wanted to avoid mentioning these details. The Washington Post ran the story on January 18. Its headline reported that 2 Californians had been charged with selling secrets. The article was constrained by what prosecutors had revealed publicly. It described the case as involving communications satellite information without explaining what that meant. The Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Department of Defense, and TRW all declined comment. They cited ongoing investigation and classified material. The careful information control lasted approximately 6 weeks. On March 3, 1977, investigative journalist Ronald Kessler published a detailed article. It appeared in the Washington Post. The article revealed that the compromised information concerned highly sensitive intelligence-gathering satellites. These satellites were capable of intercepting Soviet communications. Kessler worked from multiple intelligence community sources. He described Rhyolite's capabilities with remarkable accuracy. These included its geosynchronous orbits, its signal intelligence mission, and its ground stations in Australia. The article did not name Rhyolite specifically. However, anyone with even passing familiarity with American satellite programs could identify it. The Central Intelligence Agency was furious. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched leak investigations. Congressional intelligence committees held closed hearings. They sought to determine who had spoken to Kessler and why. The investigations went nowhere. This was primarily because multiple officials were horrified by the scope of Boyce's betrayal. They had independently decided that Congress and the public needed to understand what had been lost. The leaks were not coordinated. They were the spontaneous reaction of intelligence professionals. These professionals watched decades of careful work collapse. This collapse occurred because a 22-year-old clerk with a Minox camera had never been properly supervised. The trial began on April 25, 1977, in Los Angeles Federal Court. Judge Robert Kelleher recognized the case's sensitivity. He ordered significant portions to be conducted in closed session. Prosecutors could present classified evidence to the jury. However, spectators and press were excluded. What emerged in open testimony was nevertheless extraordinary. Federal Bureau of Investigation's Special Agent James Bamford testified. He spoke about recovering microfilm from Lee. TRW Security Director Charles Grayson testified about vault procedures and Boyce's access. Central Intelligence Agency technical officers, identified only by first names, testified in closed session. They spoke about satellite capabilities and the damage Boyce had caused. The classified testimony, portions of which were declassified decades later, revealed the full extent of the compromise. One Central Intelligence Agency witness, later identified as Richard Helms, testified in the case. Helms was a former Central Intelligence Agency director. He was called as an expert on damage assessment. Helms testified that Boyce's actions had set back American intelligence collection capabilities by at least 5 years. These actions also cost hundreds of millions of dollars in lost intelligence and required system modifications. Helms described how Soviet communications security had improved in late 1975. This improvement correlated exactly with the information Boyce had provided. American military planners had made strategic decisions based on intelligence assessments. These assessments were no longer reliable because the Soviets understood what the United States could and could not hear. Lee's defense attorney attempted to argue that his client was merely a courier. The attorney claimed Lee was unaware of the material's significance. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors introduced evidence. This evidence showed that Lee had negotiated payments with Soviet handlers. He had also requested larger sums for specific materials. Furthermore, he had discussed the content's value. Lee understood perfectly well what he was doing. He simply did not care because the money supported his cocaine habit and his lifestyle. Boyce's defense was more complex. His attorneys portrayed him as a disillusioned idealist. They said he was troubled by Central Intelligence Agency operations against Australia. He was motivated by political principle rather than greed. They presented character witnesses. These included priests from his former seminary, teachers, and family friends. These witnesses testified to his intelligence, moral seriousness, and genuine concern for ethical questions. The strategy might have generated sympathy, except for one problem. The evidence showed that Boyce had spent his Soviet payments on falconry equipment, stereo systems, and a used Mercedes. This suggested motivations somewhat less elevated than principled dissent. On April 28, after 3 weeks of testimony and 14 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted both defendants on all counts. Judge Kelleher scheduled sentencing for September. In the months between conviction and sentencing, the intelligence community completed its damage assessment. The Wallkill report was finalized in August 1977. It was classified at the highest levels of secrecy. The report ran to 347 pages. Its conclusions were devastating. On September 12, 1977, Judge Kelleher sentenced Christopher Boyce to 40 years in federal prison. He sentenced Andrew Daulton Lee to life imprisonment. In his sentencing statement, Kelleher noted the damage caused to the national security of the United States. He stated this damage could not be overstated. Their actions had endangered American lives. They had also compromised critical intelligence capabilities. Furthermore, they betrayed the trust placed in them. Lee showed no reaction. Boyce, according to courtroom observers, seemed relieved. It was the same deflated relief he had shown when arrested. It was as though some part of him welcomed the end of his secret life. The revelations continued beyond the trial. In 1979, investigative journalist Robert Lindsay published The Falcon and the Snowman. This was a comprehensive account of the case. It was based on interviews with Boyce, Lee, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, and intelligence officials. The book became a bestseller. It revealed details that had not emerged at trial. These included the casual nature of their espionage, their amateurish tradecraft, and bureaucratic incompetence on both sides. Lindsay's research included interviews with Soviet defectors. They confirmed that Moscow had immediately exploited Boyce's information to modify communications security. In 1985, a film adaptation brought the story to even wider attention. It starred Timothy Hutton and Sean Penn. The Central Intelligence Agency attempted to prevent the film's production. They argued it would further damage national security. They failed. The film portrayed Boyce relatively sympathetically. It showed him as a troubled young man caught up in events beyond his control. This infuriated intelligence officials who had spent years cleaning up his mess. The most significant revelation came in 1990. An Australian Royal Commission investigated Central Intelligence Agency activities related to satellite ground stations. The commission was prompted partly by Boyce's claims about American spying on Australia. It concluded that the Central Intelligence Agency had indeed conducted operations on Australian soil. They did this without properly informing the Australian government. American officials had also misled Canberra about the scope of intelligence collection. The finding vindicated some of Boyce's claims about Central Intelligence Agency overreach. However, it did not justify his espionage. In 1997, after serving 21 years, Boyce received parole consideration. The Central Intelligence Agency submitted a classified brief opposing parole. They argued that Boyce remained a security risk. Furthermore, they claimed his early release would send the wrong message to others with access to classified information. The parole board released him anyway. They concluded that he had served sufficient time and demonstrated rehabilitation. Lee received parole in 1998 after serving 21 years of his life sentence. The brass key was tagged as Evidence Item Federal Bureau of Investigation, Los Angeles 770156K. It remained in Federal Bureau of Investigation archives until 2003. Then it was transferred to the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. It now sits in a display case labeled Insider Threat Artifacts. This is alongside other physical remnants of espionage cases, such as a hollowed-out book used for hiding documents. Another item is a dead drop container recovered from a Vienna park. A Minox camera, similar to the one Boyce used, is also displayed. Museum visitors walk past without recognizing its significance. Careers ended. George Murphy, the TRW security director, who had approved Boyce's initial clearance, resigned under pressure. 3 Central Intelligence Agency officers responsible for contractor oversight were reassigned to positions without operational authority. The Mexico City Central Intelligence Agency station chief was criticized for failing to detect Lee's repeated visits. He completed his tour and retired early. None faced formal discipline. The failure was systemic, not individual. However, all carried the taint of association with one of the most damaging intelligence compromises in American history. Documents continued to be declassified in waves. Portions of the Wallkill damage assessment became public in 2007. Federal Bureau of Investigation interrogation transcripts followed in 2011. Central Intelligence Agency cables concerning Australian operations were released in 2015. Each release added detail to a story that was already well understood in its basic contours. The accumulation of detail revealed something perhaps more important than the facts themselves. This was the sheer institutional complacency that had allowed 2 amateurs to compromise billions of dollars of satellite infrastructure. Nobody imagined the threat could come from within. The lasting impact of the Boyce Lee case reshaped American intelligence security in ways that persist today. Within months of the trial, the Central Intelligence Agency implemented mandatory polygraph testing. This was for all contractor personnel with access to compartmented programs. The tests were not foolproof, as polygraphs measure stress, not deception. However, they created a psychological barrier. This served as a reminder that clearance came with scrutiny. TRW redesigned the Black Vault. They installed surveillance cameras. They also implemented 2-person rules for document access. Additionally, they created audit logs that tracked which specific materials each employee accessed and when. The changes came too late for Rhyolite. By late 1977, Soviet communication security had improved significantly. The satellite system's effectiveness had degraded by an estimated 40%. The National Security Agency responded by accelerating development of next-generation signals intelligence satellites. These had more sophisticated collection capabilities and different technical approaches. The new systems, codenamed Chalet and later Vortex, incorporated lessons learned from the compromise. These lessons included more focused collection, better encryption, and diversified technical methods. This aimed to make any future compromise less devastating. The Australian ground station situation proved particularly complex. The Boyce case revealed to the Australian public and Parliament. Central Intelligence Agency operations at Pine Gap and Noarunga had exceeded what the Australian government had authorised. The government had also not been fully informed about these operations. The revelations triggered a political crisis in Canberra. Labour Party members called for closing the bases. They argued that Australia had become complicit in American intelligence operations. This occurred without proper oversight or consent. The Fraser government was under intense pressure. They renegotiated the basing arrangements. These included more Australian oversight and more information sharing about operations being conducted on Australian territory. The renegotiation had an unintended strategic consequence. It made the United States-Australia intelligence relationship stronger. By forcing transparency and genuine partnership, the Boyce case transformed the relationship. It had been a colonial-style relationship, with America using Australian territory for American purposes. It became something more equitable. The ground stations remained operational. They now had Australian personnel in key positions. Australian intelligence officials also received the product. The change acknowledged what Boyce had exposed. Spying on allies might work in the short term. However, it was unsustainable when the deception inevitably came to light. The arms control implications were severe. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 negotiations were already difficult. They became more complicated when American delegates could no longer confidently assert their verification capabilities. Soviet negotiators knew that America's overhead surveillance had been compromised. They pressed harder for concessions. The treaty eventually signed in 1979 included weaker verification provisions than American negotiators had initially sought. This was partly because the United States intelligence community could not guarantee they could detect Soviet cheating. They could not do so with the same confidence they had had before Boyce. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence conducted its own post-mortem. The Soviet State Security Agency's first chief directorate produced a classified analysis. It was titled Lessons from American Espionage Case Christopher. This examined what had worked and what had failed. The report, portions of which became public after the Soviet Union's collapse, praised the intelligence value of the material received. However, it harshly criticized the handling of Lee. The report concluded that a failure to implement basic operational security measures had unnecessarily exposed the operation. It also stated that an excessive focus on technical intelligence collection had caused handlers to overlook obvious warning signs. They should have seen that the courier was unstable. The document recommended stricter protocols for handling walk-in sources. It also suggested better training for case officers. Furthermore, it called for more centralized control over operations involving highly sensitive material. These recommendations influenced KGB operations throughout the 1980s. This contributed to a more professional and disciplined approach to agent handling. Ironically, Boyce's amateurish operation helped improve Soviet intelligence tradecraft. 3 people died in ways connected to the case, though not directly. In 1983, a TRW engineer named Michael Ross committed suicide. He had worked in the Black Vault after Boyce and had undergone intensive security reinvestigation. Ross left a note citing the pressure of constant suspicion and questioning. In 1988, a Central Intelligence Agency technical officer involved in the damage assessment, Robert Kirsch, died of a heart attack. Colleagues attributed this to stress from working 80-hour weeks. He was trying to determine the full scope of what had been compromised. In 1991, a Soviet intelligence officer was identified as one of Lee's handlers in Mexico City. Major Vasily Petrovich Sokolov died in what Russian authorities called a traffic accident. However, Western intelligence analysts suspected it was an execution. This was punishment for his role in an operation that had been compromised through spectacularly poor tradecraft. 2 individuals survived to write memoirs. Christopher Boyce published American Sons, the untold story of the Falcon and the Snowman, in 2001. His wife, Kate Boyce, co-authored the book. The book provided context for his actions. It described his disillusionment with American foreign policy. He also detailed his moral objections to Central Intelligence Agency operations in Australia. Boyce believed he was exposing wrongdoing rather than committing treason. The book received mixed reviews. Veterans of the intelligence community dismissed it as self-serving rationalization. Meanwhile, civil liberties advocates found some of Boyce's critiques of Central Intelligence Agency overreach legitimate. They still considered his methods indefensible. Andrew Daulton Lee largely disappeared from public view after his release. He gave one major interview to journalist Robert Lindsay in 2005. Lee described the case as the worst mistake of his life. He acknowledged destroying careers and damaging national security for cocaine money. Lee refused to romanticize his actions or claim political motivation. When asked what he would tell young people tempted by espionage, Lee gave a strong warning. He said that they should not do it. The money, he stated, was not worth it. He also warned that the Russians would betray them. Lee concluded that they would spend 20 years in prison. There they would learn they were foolish. The technology that Boyce compromised became obsolete. This occurred due to natural evolution, not his betrayal. By the 1990s, satellite signals intelligence had shifted. It moved to digital communications intercept. It also involved different orbital configurations. Technical methods then bore little resemblance to Rhyolite. The system Boyce compromised had been replaced by newer, more sophisticated platforms. However, the strategic principle remained. America's intelligence advantage depended on technological superiority and operational security. When either of these failed, the consequences rippled across years. In 2015, Edward Snowden's disclosures revealed the National Security Agency's mass surveillance programs. Intelligence officials privately compared Snowden to Boyce. Both men were young contractors with access to highly classified systems. Both claimed political motivation. They both caused extraordinary damage to American intelligence capabilities. However, the comparison was imperfect. Snowden operated at a vastly greater scale. He used digital tools to exfiltrate millions of documents, while Boyce photographed hundreds. The insider threat had evolved with technology. Still, the fundamental vulnerability remained: the human being with access and grievance. The Boyce-Lee case spawned a minor academic industry. Doctoral dissertations analyzed their motivations, tradecraft, and psychological profiles. Intelligence studies programs used the case in teaching scenarios about insider threats. Security professionals studied the Thomson-Ramo-Wooldridge Vault's vulnerabilities. These served as examples of what to avoid. By 2025, the case had become a historical artifact. It was a cautionary tale from an earlier espionage era. Its lessons focused more on human fallibility than specific technical details. The lasting policy impact was the formalization of insider threat programs across the intelligence community. Before Boyce, security focused primarily on external threats. Foreign intelligence services, for example, attempted to recruit American personnel. After Boyce, security models incorporated a new assumption: the threat could now come from within. People with legitimate access could become adversaries. Clearance and patriotism were not sufficient guarantees of loyalty. This shift represented a darker and more paranoid security approach, but also a more realistic one. The brass key remained in its display case at the National Cryptologic Museum. It was a small brass artifact representing 19 months of systematic betrayal. Museum exhibits did not provide much context. A placard simply explained that the key belonged to a convicted spy. It stated the key was used to receive communications from foreign intelligence services. Most visitors passed by without pausing. They were more interested in the Enigma machine nearby. Others preferred the Soviet cipher equipment captured during the Cold War. The key was too small and too ordinary to attract much attention. This was appropriate. The entire case had been ordinary. It involved two ordinary young men. They were ordinary in their ambitions and weaknesses. These men had briefly touched something extraordinary. Then they poisoned it. The Central Intelligence Agency's underground archives at Langley contain a file box labelled Wall Kill Damage Assessment Final. The box sits in a climate-controlled vault alongside hundreds of similar boxes. These contain post-mortems of intelligence failures. They also hold records of operations gone wrong. The box has not been opened in years. The case it documents is history. The satellites it describes are defunct. Moreover, the Soviet Union it was meant to surveil no longer exists. Inside the box, beneath 347 pages of technical analysis and operational review, sits a single photograph. The photo shows Christopher Boyce's desk in the Black Vault at TRW. This was a standard government-issue metal desk. Its grey paint was slightly chipped at the corners. On the desk were a KW7 encryption davia, a secure telephone, and a stack of message traffic. A coffee cup with TRW's logo and a calendar for July 1975 were also present. The photograph was taken during the Federal Bureau of Investigation's initial evidence collection. This happened before anything was disturbed. It was also before investigators began determining what had been accessed and compromised. The calendar is marked with notations in Boyce's handwriting. Most are innocuous, such as dentist appointments, dry cleaning reminders, and weekend plans. However, 3 dates are marked with small stars, barely visible in the photograph. These dates were July 8, July 15, and July 23. Federal Bureau of Investigation investigators determined these were dates when Andrew Daulton Lee travelled to Mexico City. The stars served as Boyce's private reminder to prepare microfilm for delivery. The stars represented a kind of banal evil, which was the bureaucratic routine of treason rather than dramatic spy novel betrayal. The process involved marking the calendar, photographing documents, and passing the film. This cycle was repeated regularly, much like marking dates for trash collection or car maintenance. Evil was thus reduced to an administrative routine. Betrayal transformed into just another item on a to-do list. The final irony, revealed in declassified interviews decades later, was that Boyce almost quit before he started. In April 1975, when Lee first proposed contacting the Soviets, Boyce hesitated. He understood the magnitude of their plan and the consequences if caught. He spent a week considering it. He weighed his political rationale against the reality of committing espionage. What tipped the balance was not ideology, conviction, or even money. Instead, it was the realization that he could easily do it. The security around him was minimal. Oversight was absent. Trust was complete, meaning betrayal would be almost absurdly easy. He was right. For 19 months, it was easy. He photographed documents at his desk during work hours. He passed film to Lee during weekend hangouts. Lee carried the film to Mexico in his jacket pocket. The Russians paid cash. Nobody noticed. Nobody checked. Nobody imagined that the greatest compromise of American satellite intelligence in history was being carried out. This was done by two young men who could not be bothered to learn basic tradecraft. This continued until the evening Lee threw an envelope over the Soviet embassy wall. Mexican police then arrested him 3 blocks away. It also lasted until Federal Bureau of Investigation agents entered the Black Vault. There they found Boyce sitting at his desk. He was processing classified cables and touching the brass key in his pocket one last time. The photograph remains in its box. The box remains in its vault. The vault remains secure, protected by guards, cameras, and all the apparatus of secrecy. However, this apparatus failed to protect against a 22-year-old. This young man had a Minox camera and a calendar marked with stars. Sometimes the greatest secrets are not protected by sophisticated technology or elaborate procedure. Sometimes they are protected only by the assumption that nobody would be stupid enough, bold enough, or reckless enough to betray them. Christopher Boyce and Andrew Daulton Lee were all 3. For 19 months, that was enough. The satellite they compromised continued its orbit long after their arrest. It spun through the void above the Earth at 22,300 miles altitude. It listened to Soviets' communications with damaged ears. This technological marvel was rendered partially blind. A bored clerk and a drug dealer needing cash caused this damage. Eventually, the satellite exhausted its station-keeping fuel. It drifted into what engineers call a graveyard orbit. This is a path where defunct satellites go to die. They circle the Earth uselessly, serving as monuments to obsolescence. It is still up there, somewhere above the equator. It is a multi-billion-dollar piece of space debris. It listens to nothing and reports to no one. It keeps secrets that no longer matter. Except they did matter. The secrets mattered deeply for the men whose lives they destroyed. They mattered for intelligence officers who spent careers rebuilding what was lost. They also mattered for strategic planners who made decisions based on degraded information. Furthermore, they mattered for Australian politicians who discovered their country had been used and misled. For all of them, the secrets mattered deeply. They still do, in memory and in consequence. They also matter in the dark lesson they taught about trust and betrayal. This includes the terrible fragility of even the most sophisticated systems when confronted with simple human weakness. The brass key is real. The stars on the calendar are real. The satellite spinning in graveyard orbit is real. Somewhere in Moscow, in the archives of what was once the Committee for State Security, sits a file. It is on an operation designated Source Christopher. This file contains microfilm photographs of American satellite specifications. These helped Soviet engineers understand exactly what their adversary could see and hear from space. That file too sits unopened. It is a Cold War artifact in a post-Cold War world. It is evidence of an espionage case that succeeded brilliantly until it failed catastrophically. The case earned $76,000 and cost billions. It lasted 19 months and echoed for decades. 2 young men wanted money and importance. They got both, but only briefly. Then they received 40 years and life in prison. The mathematics of that transaction suggests a bargain so poor that it defies rational calculation. It involved $76,000 for decades in prison. It included 19 months of espionage for permanent infamy. However, rationality was not the currency they were trading in. They dealt in excitement, in risk, and in the thrill of touching something forbidden. In that economy, they got exactly what they paid for.